The gentleman from New York, Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capter. The gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester. The gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Stefanik. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Mike Johnson. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole. The gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Spartz.
The President of the Senate, at the direction of that body, appoints the following senators as members of the Committee on the part of the Senate to escort the President of the United States into the House chamber. The Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer.
I just want to explain what you're seeing and hearing.
Vermont,
Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are naming the folks who are on the escort committee, right, who will be escorting President and other dignitaries into the room. And this is, you know, an interesting moment here as we're seeing these interactions. And Yamiche, one of the things that you had said, too, seeing Vice President Harris side by side with House Speaker Pelosi, Andrea Mitchell touched on that as well. For many Democrats, obviously in particular, a striking and important moment, and one that may not happen again next year, depending on how the midterms go.
It's a good point, because you see these two women, and politics aside, they have the most power in politics that women have had in a generation. And it's so striking to see them standing there. And it's also striking to see the second gentleman waving, kind of doing what you see a spouse usually do.
Right. Talking now.
Doing a ceremonial role.
We're seeing this shot again with the Ukrainian ambassador, Doug Emhoff.
Yeah, so I think all of that is really important. But you bring up a good point, which is that the midterms are around the corner, and as all of this is happening, Nancy Pelosi's leadership is on the line now.
The next moment that we will see, of course, is going to be some of the entries into the chamber. You're going to see the House Sergeant at Arms do the traditional call out, Anna. That is sort of the sound that we associate so well with the State of the Union. And we're getting close to that at this point.
Yes, that drama of coming in with that loud voice, which really is the start of this experience. We're about to hear it.
I mean, we haven't seen the Supreme Court justices seated either, the ones who are attending. I think that's coming up here soon, too. And as we talked about, we don't expect to see all of them, but obviously the justices being there takes on a different flavor, considering they're about to get, you know, if the confirmation of
KBJ.
President Biden's pick goes well.
Yeah, Judge Jackson possibly coming to the court will shift things in a symbolic way. Of course, it'll still be a 6-3 court. A reminder, again, of how partisan this is, but also a reminder that this is one of the most important events in Washington, D.C. in the country, and that the president is going to be delivering a speech by an American president that could be one of the most important since the Cold War.
Yeah, what's interesting, too, here is oftentimes when you're in the chamber, you're watching to see who's the kind of sitting out on the aisle, because there's a lot of members who flock to that. They like to do it. Unfortunately, because of COVID, they are in assigned seats now, so it's a little less crowded than what you would kind of typically expect.
Can't game the system, show up early, pull an Elliot angle, and like try to be in the camera shot. You can't do that anymore?
So Joe Biden, I'm sure President Biden will find a way to mingle.
We expect to see the introduction. That's for sure. We expect to see at some point soon the introduction, of course, of First Lady Jill Biden. We've been taking some of these shots as we are living in these live pictures here of the box where she has guests. And we've talked a lot about the ambassador of Ukraine. And Jeremy Bash, you've referenced what her presence means, the participation of her here. But there are other guests as well. There are kids from, well, at least one child from around the country, right? Kids from around the country, because you would imagine President Biden will talk about the importance of schools opening back up, the impact of the pandemic on kids, for example. You have Frances Haugen, you know, the Facebook whistleblower, she's become known, who will be attending as well, fitting into the president's speech as it relates to social media and the impact that these social media platforms can have. You have a nurse from a progressive care unit, again, pandemic related, as well as other students students and others who are important to the president's speech. I talked with one former speechwriter to a different president earlier today who was talking about you want to weave those stories into these remarks because in many ways you are not just laying out policy, you're telling a story. You're telling a story to Americans and you want them to be compelled.
Personal. Right?
Personal.
You want it
Yeah.
to be to have something be a face to these issues instead of just broad strokes that are hard to understand. I think actually really interesting hearing Senator Joe Manchin talking to Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska.
Moderate Republican,
Mitt
moderate
Romney
Democrat.
talking to Susan Collins. This is some votes for KBJ right there.
I mean,
Justices of the Supreme Court.
Okay, so let's see what. So. Justice Howard, Justice Kagan, Justice Kavanaugh, and I see Justice Amy Coney Barrett there.
I believe it is her first State of the Union address that she is attending. Keep in mind, there was only one Supreme Court justice present last go-round, right, because of the pandemic. Chief Justice Roberts.
There's Justice Kavanaugh shaking hands with General McConnell, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the members of the Joint Chiefs, and that's the Supreme Court members shaking hands with the Joint Chiefs. A great spectacle of American leadership. Bipartisan, nonpartisan American leadership.
But also puts them in some potentially awkward moments, Jeremy, as we've seen, when the audience around them is erupting either in applause or not. Right?
It does, and for the most part, the national security content should be bipartisan, but sometimes it veers, and sometimes they have to not applaud so they don't appear in any way to support any partisan position. Yet the president is their commander-in-chief.
Right.
He's in the chain. They are in the chain of command, so to speak, and they obviously have to salute Joe Biden because he's president.
Right. And obviously their presence, too, taking on such an important shade, given everything that we're seeing overseas. Justice Kavanaugh's third State of the Union speech, by the way. And here comes First Lady Jill Biden. Let's listen. A big hug there from the First Lady to the Ukrainian ambassador. And this is not a position with which she is unfamiliar, right? I mean, she has attended these in her capacity as the Second Lady in years past.
Yes.
And she was obviously here, again, for the address from President Biden last go-around. Not a formal State of the Union. This is the formal State of the Union speech. Very significant still, as these all are every year.
She's a teacher, too. I mean, I think that's going to be interesting as we think about what he says on COVID, how she responds. Does he point to
Madam
her
Speaker,
experience
the
there as well?
President's Cabinet.
And they all will be there, and they will all be applauding.
No, they want their job is for them of whether they should clap. You're right. And there are, you look at somebody like Tony Blinken, right, the Secretary of State who's coming in, who's shaking hands. Who knows, many of these people from his roles in different capacities elsewhere.
He was the staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and of course, Secretary Austin, who was before that the CENTCOM commander, so he goes deep with a lot of these members as well. And those are the two guys who are managing the U.S. participation in the NATO alliance to stand up to Vladimir Putin.
You have to think that they've been consulting even, not just obviously on strategy and on tactics here, but with what we will hear from President Biden as he outlines his position and really takes on Vladimir Putin as we expect him to do in this speech tonight as he has done so far.
Yeah, especially because this was a speech that had to be revised and revised and revised as things in Eastern Europe continue to deteriorate. You know that the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary are important figures, but at a time like this, they have become the core people that he's been interacting with and talking to in the last few days. And I will also say, talking earlier about sort of President Biden having to connect with people and tell a story. People who have covered Joe Biden know he can tell a story, only because of who he is, but also because of his own life experiences, having lost children, having lost a wife. He is someone who can dig deep and try to empathize with people in a way that others can't.
It's been really interesting watching so many of these cabinet members are former members of the House or they're kind of embracing their colleagues in ways. You see Sheila Jackson Lee really talking to lots of folks on the end. She's kind of one of those perennial line standers that likes to get into the mix there.
And those assigned seats are being unassigned. They made it to the aisle.
Yamiche Alcindor, Anna Palmer, Jeremy Bash, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our guests and reporters who have been with us. Our special coverage continues right now with an NBC News special report.
president, 1 year into office, facing massive challenges at home and abroad. On the domestic front, record inflation causing prices to rise and the president's approval rating to drop. Overseas, Russia invading Ukraine, a conflict that could reshape the map of Europe. All this as the nation tries to emerge from a pandemic. Lives of nearly 1 million Americans and widen political divisions. With the midterm elections only 8 months away, the president facing a sharply divided Congress in the House chamber tonight as he makes his case to lawmakers and the American people that the State of the Union is strong.
From NBC News, President Biden's State of the Union. Live from Washington, here are Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie.
And good evening from Washington. I'm Savannah Guthrie here with Lester Holt. And just moments from now, President Joe Biden will enter the House chamber to give his first official State of the Union address. And it comes at a moment when the world is in crisis and on the precipice. Russia has invaded its neighbor Ukraine, shattering peace in Europe and unleashing a massive assault growing more brutal by the day. We're on the ground in Ukraine tonight as the world waits for what message President Biden will deliver to Americans, to Ukrainians, and to Moscow tonight.
And as always, issues here at home to grapple with. You've got the pandemic, rising inflation hitting Americans hard. Any moment now, we expect the Sergeant at Arms to announce the president's arrival. There's a big difference from last year, and that is the size of the crowd. All members of Congress were invited to attend tonight's address. And listen to this, masks are optional, something we have not seen since the start of the pandemic. Everyone in attendance was required to show a negative PCR test prior to entry. We're also seeing ramped up security tonight. The fencing that went up around the Capitol following the January 6th insurrection is back with National Guard troops on standby. I want to go right to NBC's chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, good evening.
Lester, good evening to you and Savannah. To be clear here, President Biden's aides say there is no question that this is a different speech than he would have been giving just a couple of weeks ago, punctuating one of the most consequential periods of his presidency in the midst of the only days after announcing his pick to be the first black woman on the Supreme Court. This is a high-stakes balancing act. Ukraine, I'm told, will be a dominant theme. The president will try to demonstrate his leadership on one of the greatest threats to European stability since World War II and to deliver a rebuke to Vladimir Putin for what he will call a premeditated and unprovoked war. And we have just learned tonight that the president will announce that the U.S. will close its airspace to Russian aircraft. Still, his challenge this evening, a job approval, as you note, that's at an all-time low. Americans dissatisfied with his handling of crime and immigration and inflation. Look for him to express empathy with those economic struggles, detailing how he's working to cut costs to help working families. And I'm going to be watching his tone tonight. In this deeply divided country, officials here are previewing what they call a unity agenda, focusing on priorities that have been historically bipartisan. And Lester and Savannah, just moments ago, we learned that the designated survivor during tonight's State of the Union will be the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo.
All right, Peter, thank you. We want to turn now to our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. He is in Ukraine's capital city of Kiev tonight, as we see some of the military members, General Milley, of course, in the House chamber tonight. We saw Tony Blinken. Richard, you are in Kiev. This is a city that is surrounded. Russian forces engaging in a 6-day brutal assault, one that is expected to get even worse as the days wear on. What is the situation you're seeing on the ground at this hour?
There is a lot of concern, particularly with what is happening in the city of Kharkiv, and people are worried that what is happening to the second city in this country could be the fate of Kiev. Kharkiv right now is completely surrounded by Russian forces. It is being attacked from the outside by Russian artillery, airstrikes, missiles, and then just a short while ago, according to Ukrainian intelligence, there was a Russian air assault into the city itself. And they worry that this pattern could repeat itself on a city twice its size, the city of Kiev, with first Russia encircling the city, then attacking it, and then landing troops inside. And just a short while ago, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, made an appeal. He said that this country needs help. that without more assistance, it is not going to be able to confront Russia on its own. Up until now, the Ukrainian military has been able to keep the Russians at bay and has been putting up a heroic defense. But a new kind of tactic would be much more difficult.
And Richard, the president has entered the House chamber. We expect this walk to last quite a few minutes, as it often does. He'll greet some of the members of Congress, the assembled guests. We've seen several members of the Supreme Court, the cabinet. And again, no masks in the chamber tonight. Well, masks were optional, and many have chosen not to wear them. So we're starting to see that return to normalcy. We want to bring in NBC's political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and our chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell.
And watching this, it struck me that it feels like we're about to see a wartime speech, but this country is not at war, but it is one that Americans certainly have followed with great interest and have, certainly felt the pain of some of the soul-crushing moments we've witnessed in that part of the world.
You know, it's interesting. The president actually has an opportunity tonight that I don't think he would have had 2 weeks ago, which is more people are going to tune into the speech. It's going to be a little less of a partisan audience. You know, the past few states of the union have very much, you could almost feel, you see it, where, if one party watches its president, the other party doesn't. Tonight, with the uncertainty of what's going on in Ukraine, the uncertainty of the threats from Putin, the president has an opportunity to talk to some people he hasn't perhaps been able to talk to in a while. Now, that's the challenge, of course, of this speech is to see if what he says penetrates the public. I think he's had a hard time penetrating and getting them to listen to what he has to say in domestic politics. I do think this is his wheelhouse. This is what he has, in some ways, been preparing his whole professional life for, is this moment to manage a crisis in Europe. So he's perhaps ready for this moment. And so the opportunity tonight to meet it.
And as I turn to you, Andrea, our chief foreign affairs correspondent, I mean, this is a moment for history. This is a moment where the president is likely to talk about the forces for democracy versus the forces of a dictator and set it in quite stark terms.
And he's hoping, as we see the president handing the speech, the text to the vice president, of course, and the Speaker of the House, he's hoping that all the Republican criticism that he did not move quickly enough to arm Ukraine will now be resolved because they have taken decisive action.
The high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
And Savannah, this could be a rare moment of bipartisanship. He's hoping the kind that he remembers, bipartisanship, politics stopping at the water's edge on foreign policy.
It's very blue and yellow out there already in that crowd. You can see there was a lot of blue and yellow among members.
And they're wearing pins, the Ukrainian flag with the U.S. flag.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, General. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Please. Thank you so much. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, our First Lady and Second Gentleman, members of Congress and the Cabinet, Justices of the Supreme Court, my fellow Americans. Last year, COVID-19 kept us apart. This year, we're finally together again. Tonight, we meet as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, but most importantly, as Americans, with the duty to one another, to America, to the American people, to the Constitution, and an unwavering resolve that freedom will always triumph over tyranny. Thank you. Six days ago, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. And President Zelensky, to every Ukrainian, their fearlessness, their courage, their determination literally inspires the world. Groups of citizens blocking tanks with their bodies, everyone from students to retirees to teachers, turned soldiers defending their homeland. And in this struggle, President Zelensky said in his speech to the European Parliament, "Light will win over darkness." The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States is here tonight, sitting with the First Lady. Let each of us, if you're able to stand and send an unmistakable signal to the world of Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She's bright, she's strong, she's resolved. Yes, we, the United States of America, stand with the Ukrainian people. Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving, and the cost, the threats to America and America to the world keeps rising. That's why the NATO alliance was created, to secure peace and stability in Europe after World War II. The United States is a member, along with 29 other nations. It matters. American diplomacy matters. American resolve matters. Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond. He thought he could divide us at home, in this chamber, in this nation. He thought he could divide us in Europe as well. But Putin was wrong. We are ready. We are united, and that's what we did. We stayed united. We prepared extensively and carefully. We spent months building coalitions of other freedom-loving nations in Europe and the Americas, from America to the Asian and African continents, to confront Putin. Like many of you, I spent countless hours unifying our European allies. We shared with the world in advance what we knew Putin was planning and precisely how he would try to falsify and justify his aggression. We countered Russia's lies with the truth. And now that he's acted, the free world is holding him accountable, along with 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and many others. Even Switzerland are inflicting pain on Russia and supporting the people of Ukraine. Putin is now isolated from the world